weaken white supremacy. He didn't want it to happen because he said, if black men were made, quote, the instrument by which your battles are fought, the means by which your victories are won, you must treat him as a victor is entitled to be treated with all decent and becoming respect. Of course, to him, treating black Americans as with decent and becoming respect was unthinkable. And James Weldon Johnson, a civil rights leader and really brilliant writer, sort of made the same point during World War I, because he said that African Americans ought to fight because the moment he ceases to perform the duties of citizenship, he abdicates the right to the claim of the right to claim the full rights of citizenship. And so that's, on one hand, sort of the idea is that service in war creates a moral claim that is sort of universally recognizable. The thing that I talk about in the piece a little bit is that precisely because it does this, it has also always been met with backlash, right? And particularly after World War I, there was a soldier after soldier was lynched, burned alive, chained to a post and riddled with bullets. It's a pretty, some of them for things like wearing their uniform too long. There's this historian who I referenced in the piece, Mickelson, who talks about how there was a Southern newspaper where you would find in the same paper, right, the same edition of the same paper, the same day, an article titled something like, let's treat our soldiers with respect, and then another article justifying the lynching of a black soldier. And so the fact that service in war did make a claim on citizenship was precisely the reason that black soldiers were targeted, and that happened after World War II as well. In Bloods by Wallace Terry, which is a really remarkable book of Vietnam veterans, black Vietnam veteran oral history. Sergeant Major Edgar Huff was the first black sergeant major in the Marine Corps. Tells a story from his youth about the Ku Klux Klan coming, and he says at the end of the chapter, whenever the Ku Kluxers would come, I would be terrified. It was the damnedest thing. And I thought about that many times when I was overseas and I had those beautiful machine guns. I would just wish to hell I had something like that back in Alabama when those son of bitches came through there. I would have laid them out like I did those damn Kongs, the same way. I just don't see how black people survived down there in those days. I just don't see it. And so and I think there's a claim on citizenship, I think a political consciousness that sometimes comes along with that. But then also precisely because there is that claim on citizenship, there's often in American history there's been a really vicious and nasty counterattack.
That brings us to the stories of Ali and Ted, two Iraqis who served as translators with the U.S. military and were promised visas to the U.S. as part of the special immigrant visa program. Ali was brought to the U.S., became a naturalized citizen in 2009, and then joined the U.S. Army and deployed again to the Middle East. Ted, on the other hand, is still waiting.
It was interesting talking to these guys because, so the piece sort of talks about two guys who served as interpreters with U.S. forces. And the first one is a guy named Ali who, when he was growing up, he remembers being a kid in the run-up to the Persian Gulf War, and there are all kinds of rumors swirling around that, Americans are going to come in, they're going to torture people, they're going to commit massacres, et cetera, et cetera. And the family is getting nervous, and Ali said, he told me, we didn't know anything. We were living in a big prison. And his father sees that the family is kind of getting freaked out in the run-up to the Persian Gulf War. And his father was a retired sergeant major in the Iraqi army. And he gathers the clan together and he says, hey, let me tell you something. Americans would never target civilians. So let's just enjoy the show. And then when, obviously we didn't invade Iraq during that time, but, later we do when 10 years later after sanctions and Ali is sort of, helped his family as best he could through sort of difficult times. And his first contact with Americans is through these propaganda pamphlets that we sort of have planes drop over Iraq that say, the coalition wishes no harm to the innocent Iraqi civilians. And he grabs one, he shows it to his father, because it seemed to, proved his father right. after 10 years. And Ali's father's like, yeah, I told you, man. So that was his. I mean, he didn't know a lot about America, but that was one of the things that he felt, that America is the kind of country that doesn't do that, right? And then he signs up as an interpreter for the Americans. The Americans, the rhetoric at the time was very Wilsonian in some ways, right? George Bush talking about these universal kind of classical liberal values. We're going to go forward with complete confidence because freedom is the permanent hope of mankind, the hunger in dark places, the longing for the soul, right? And for Ali, serving with Americans also felt to him like serving his country, right? And then he's in a lot of really intense experiences. He's at the Battle of Najaf, the first Battle of Najaf. He been assigned to units in really aggressive neighborhoods with a lot of IEDs, and then I opened the piece with one particular firefight where he was sort of really thought he was going to die, and where he starts calling out, "We're Americans," and he ultimately would get one of these special immigrant visas when the program starts. And he's one of the first people to get one of these visas to come to America because he served the Americans. And he comes to America. He then joins the army and goes back to Iraq as an American soldier. And then, on the other hand, there's this guy, Ted. And Ted had fled to Syria at the beginning of the war because insurgents had seen him talking to Americans and being friendly with Americans. He had learned about America watching TV, right? He'd seen Seinfeld and Cheers. He loved Ted Danson's character in Cheers, and so his interpreter name is Ted. He named himself after Ted Danson. He got threatened. He had to go to Syria for a while. Then came back when his family relocated to a different part of Iraq, and so he joined as an interpreter in 2007. It's very violent, and they put him with Marine Recon, which is a pretty aggressive unit. He has no idea. He doesn't have a lot of training. He's quickly in his first firefight. And he tells me, I just went cold, right? But the people around him, very brave. And he sort of, that coldness kind of helped him operate in a firefight. And then later he actually gets a letter of commendation from the commander of Recon Battalion for his own courage in a firefight where he rushes through fire to help sort of capture an insurgent who wanted to surrender and then do a tactical interrogation that helped sort of shape the operations to end this engagement that the platoon had gotten into. And so he ends up applying for one of these visas, or kind of sort of a long bureaucratic process as to what happens. But eventually you have the rise of ISIS, which puts things on hold because State Department personnel leave. It kind of creates this cascade effect where certain types of security clearances and things and checks that people have to go through, they have an expiration date. And because the applications are being processed so slow, everybody's sort of checks are expiring, and then they have to do them again. And then you have the Muslim ban, which puts things on hold again. And now what you have is a situation where under the Trump administration, where just admissions for all types of refugees, including interpreters, they've just sort of gone off a cliff, right, in terms of the number of people that we're admitting. And so, for Ted, he still thinks of himself as a Marine. And, he told me that when he's in a difficult situation and he's living in an area where nobody knows that he had been an interpreter. His career as an interpreter ended because of a back injury that he got on the job while working as a terp. He had no medication, no real help. He was just, on his back for months afterwards. And he is in an area with a lot of sort of militia activity. Even his daughters don't know that he served as an interpreter because, a slip of the tongue could get him killed. And he said, when I'm in a bad situation, I measure myself wearing my vest and my helmet, surrounded by Marines, and I'll tell myself, hey, Ted, you're a Marine. You can get through these obstacles. And that's why I'm still hanging in there, man, And, for him, he's he told me, I want to live American dreams, to live free, freedom and respect. That's the American dream. And I still think I'm a Marine. I'm honored to be a Marine. I wish I could work with the Marines one more time. And I don't know, it kills me because he's the kind of guy that who would be a real addition to the country, right? And who, served the country and put his life on the line for the country. And, the guys that he served with, look, we're talking about guys of all political persuasions, right? And I only quote one in the piece, Ben Wormington. But, I talked to a lot of the guys, and they all loved him, and a lot of them just expressed this same confusion, like, why is he not here already? And Ben Wormington was like, he comes over here, he can sleep on my couch, like he can come into my home and sleep on my couch. And, in terms of, what America represents, there's that sort of freedom and opportunity and respect that it is for Ted. And Ben said something that I thought was really interesting. This Marine who served with Ted overseas, he said, being an American is like being a Christian. It ain't easy. Nobody said it was going to be easy, but if you don't pursue those beliefs, then you don't believe. And it reminded me of, Ralph Ellison in The Little Man at Shield Station talks about how America is this abstract, futuristic project, right? It's this kind of goal on the horizon that we're always reaching towards, where, we have these kind of like sacred words like equality, democracy, freedom, that, we're constantly eating and regurgitating and eating again, but that to be an American is to pursue that goal, right? And, that means that a sort of vision of Americanness that is rooted too much, especially in like a racialized form of culture, is just, it's not just stagnant and immoral, but it's a sort of false nostalgia for something that never existed and is kind of counter to what America actually is. And, towards the end of the piece, I talk about the fact that, like, America's home to 19% of the world's migrants, right? Which is many times more than there are in any other country. And most, like a huge numbers of Americans say that immigration is a good thing, that openness to foreigners is essential to who we are as a nation. And so I talk about how, like, I sort of contrast that kind of nativist vision of American culture with a sort of sense of that, like, ever-present turbulence and change that being an American means embracing, right? That sort of melding of different peoples and new forms of cultural expression and having a attachment to that process and the nation that sort of helps it happen and provides a home for this unified diversity. And I sort of say in the piece that in that regard, American identity is like Heraclitus's river, which no one can step into twice, which is in some ways challenging, right? And it requires a certain amount of faith in the principles of American life to actually have the potential to be unifying, the faith in the people that we have here. But it also requires a kind of rage at our constant failure to meet up to that, meet that promise, right? And it requires hard work to try and sort of move the ball forward, and sort of at the end of the piece, I just say it takes courage, which I think is just sort of factually true. And it's also one of the reasons why I think, we would be lucky to have more guys like Ted here.
And so I guess just kind of connecting the dots, this idea of American nativism, this racialized charge, sentiment of Americanness is what kind of draws those parallels between the stories of the Melting Pot Battalion and all those immigrant veterans who served, the African American veterans who served. That draws the parallel with the story of these Iraqi interpreters who have served alongside service members and yet are not being welcomed in.
Yeah, and it's sort of, in some ways they're, what is happening to them is not just, to me, it seems not just, isolate moral betrayal, but indicative of the rise of a particular type of toxic notion of Americanness and frankly, a kind of cowardice when it comes to the idea that our values are actually universal and that they can be put into practice, And I think we as a country deserve a lot better from our elected officials. And I think